10, Big 550 KTRS. We don't know where we're going if we don't know where we came from and how we got started, which is why Lynne Cheney's new book on James Madison, A Life Reconsidered, is considered the definitive biography now of our fourth president of the United States, James Madison. And if you do not know the name or know him as one of those old, crusty old-timers who was a president, you do not realize that his fingerprints are all over 21st century life. To talk about it is the author of the new book, James Madison, now in paperback, New York Times bestseller, A Life Reconsidered, James Madison. Lynne Cheney, welcome to KTRS here in St. Louis.
Well, thank you. That was a great introduction, especially of the idea that the founders are so much part of our lives today, and Madison in particular.
Well, let's first start with where I'm sitting. I am sitting on land that was purchased in the Louisiana Purchase, which, if it wasn't for James Madison, I wouldn't be sitting here. Is that correct?
Well, Thomas Jefferson got cold feet after the agreement had been reached for the United States to purchase Louisiana. Jefferson started worrying that it wasn't constitutional. And I think he said something like, if we can do Louisiana today, what are we going to do tomorrow? Holland? And Madison calmed him down, as Madison often calmed Jefferson down, and pointed out to him that it was perfectly constitutional. It was a treaty, and the president had treaty powers. And so Jefferson signed the agreement. So that's right. You could be part of France.
Well, we would have gotten it somehow. We just don't know how we probably would have gotten it, but it was interesting the way we did get it.
It was inevitable, wasn't it?
Right, yeah. So how much of a controversy was that during the day? Was this a 10-minute conversation, or did they struggle over this for weeks and months?
No, there was a long struggle, but the benefit, I mean, if you did a cost-benefit analysis, my goodness, this was doubling the size of the United States. And I think that among the most forward-looking members of the founding generation, there was an understanding that this experiment that they had begun was bound to expand, and that people were already crossing into the Louisiana territory, that it was a good idea to make this part of our country.
$15 million all those years later. All right. So, Lynne Cheney, why James Madison? What was it about James Madison that made you want to write this book?
Well, you caught on it in your introduction. People don't know him very well. He was absolutely essential to the creation of the United States. And I suspect that if you were going to do a survey, that you'd find very few people who could identify him. And that seems to me sad, because he did accomplish so much, but it has a real and substantial importance, too. I think if we don't understand the amazing accomplishment and the hard task of starting this country, we don't realize how fortunate we are to live in it, and we begin to take it for granted and not understand that our liberty and our freedom, that they need tended and watched and guarded.
He, of course, is the father of the Constitution, father of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. Let's start with the first one, because now we sort of take it for granted. I can say any mean thing I want about your husband, and the government cannot arrest me, fine me, or anything like that. And that comes from the First Amendment. And writing that 200 years ago was unheard of at the time.
Madison was really an early proponent of all sorts of intellectual freedom. Even when he was a young man, before he really got involved in politics, he understood the importance of freedom of religion, that you should be able to espouse whatever belief you want. It was a theme of his, and we're so lucky that he was at the Constitutional Convention and could advocate for freedom of speech, religion there. And then, of course, when he was president during war, he made sure that no one's freedom to speak out would be trampled on. There was a great, strong feeling in the Northeast that the War of 1812 was wrong. It was economically damaging to the Northeast. And talk of starting another country, talk of secession, but talk was okay. I mean, Madison was prepared to send in troops if it went beyond talk, but talk was okay. He defended that idea. And even though it means that public figures can be criticized unreasonably, it's a really good thing that we have that principle at the basis of our republic.
Lynne Cheney, the book is called James Madison, and it's in paperback now, and it was a New York Times bestseller when it first came out. But think about this for a second. Even today in 2015, there are people who want to trample on First Amendment rights, not only across the world, but in this very country. We're talking 200 plus years ago that James Madison was smart enough to know that we should be allowed to say anything we want. Talk about being forward thinking.
I try to imagine what it would be like to live in, say, Russia or another country where if you say what you think, you get thrown in jail on one pretense or another, or you get killed. What would it be like to live in a country like that? We're so fortunate to have this principle, and we need to really be strong in supporting and defending it.
Lynne, how did you go about writing the book? How did you research it?
Well, a lot of stuff is on the internet now, so it's really quite amazing. All of James Madison's letters are there. But you can't find everything on the internet, and you can't, I think, get the kind of feeling for the atmosphere that you need by just sitting in your office. So, of course, I traveled. I've been to Montpelier many times, and that is a real treasure house now. It's undergone renovation. More is coming along, so you begin to get an idea of Madison. It's a lovely home, but it's also kind of simple. If you compare it with Monticello, Jefferson's home, it's a really good indication of the two men's personalities. Monticello was quite dramatic. Montpelier is lovely, and it's the kind of place that Dolly would have put together.
Who they call her right? She was the founder of the First Ladies, more or less.
Well, she was just a wonderful, wonderful person to research and write about. She was so warm and so outgoing. She, I think, was one of the first ladies or one of the political wives in the whole history of the United States who really did make a difference because she brought people into her house where they could meet Madison, who wasn't, a glad-hander. He didn't go out and slap people on the backs, but she brought them into their house and fed them good Southern comfort food and made sure they visited with him where he was standing over by the fireplace, so that they learned to admire not only his intellect, but his personality. They grew to feel warm and comfortable with him.
Lynne Cheney, our guest for a couple more minutes. Her book is James Madison. It's about the fourth president of the United States. We're talking about the Bill of Rights. Once the Bill of Rights were written and the Constitution was written, it then had to be ratified. How hard of a job was it for James Madison to twist arms to get people to ratify the Constitution?
Well, it was an amazing task. He and Alexander Hamilton, with a little bit of help from John Jay, wrote the Federalist Papers to justify the Constitution. And, of course, they've become one of the, sacred documents of our history. Madison wrote, I think it's 22 essays of the Federalist in 40 days. That's how fast they were moving. And I once told a group of college students, you could do that, I could do that. We could write 22 essays in 40 days, but our words wouldn't be immortal. We wouldn't change the world with our words. And this is just a way of trying to understand how great their accomplishments were.
What was the fight between him and Hamilton?
Well, Madison had in the beginning worried that the central government wouldn't be strong enough. The states had done a lot to really tear the nation apart before the Constitution. They were coining their own money, for example, and establishing their own foreign policies and going into great rivalry with fellow states. So Madison wanted a strong central government to stop that. But then Alexander Hamilton came along, and he wanted a central government so big, so strong, and so intrusive in Madison's view that Madison, at that point, together with Jefferson, established an opposition party. When the Constitution was written and ratified, nobody had the idea that we would need to have parties, that we would need a party that would oppose what the government was doing. So that was among Madison's other amazing accomplishments, that he saw that was necessary. You can't just say, well, it's our government and what it's doing is okay. when it's not doing what's right, you have to stand up in opposition.
So what you're saying is that some of the same arguments we have today, they were having 200 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. And I've often thought that, if Madison came back, he'd be appalled at the size and scope of the federal government. But I think Hamilton would be, too. It's gotten so big and intrudes into so many areas of our lives that I think they would both be appalled.
A traditional historian would write a book about James Madison and would write it differently than you've had a front row seat to history. You've been the wife of the vice president for 8 years. You've been there. You've seen it. How did your history and your perspective work as trying to write this story?
Well, I think it helped me understand, the people cut deals, that sometimes they say things for public purposes that they're not saying in private, that there is a lot that just hasn't changed, that there are people who have their own personal interests in mind rather than the good of the country. And I do think that probably helps to have had experience of that.
Good and bad, I guess.
Sure, and I am struck when I think about Madison and others of the founders too, how they had the interests of the country in mind. That really was they knew they were present at this great historical moment, and the idea of creating a republic and making it succeed was a part of their every waking moment. That kind of intensity and dedication, I think we miss that a lot when we read history. I think the best way to read history is to read biography. Is to see that the people who were doing it were human, and that they wanted so much to create the country we know today.
Lynne Cheney, the book is called James Madison, A Life Reconsidered. It's considered the definitive biography of the fourth president of the United States, James Madison. Lynne Cheney, thank you very much for your service, and thank you for the time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You got it. 9:22 here, Big 550, KTR.